This morning I wanted to start with what is a fairly well-known poem. You probably figured out what it is if you know it at all. One that gets used a lot, mostly in a certain context, in a certain set of circumstances, but it works well for this morning. So I invite you to hear the words of this poem called "The Dash" by Linda Ellis. I read of a man who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on the tombstone from the beginning to the end. He noted that first came the date of birth and spoke the following date with tears. But he said what mattered most of all was the dash between those years. For that dash represents all the time that they spent alive on earth, and now only those who love them know what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love, how we spend our dash. So think about this long and hard. Are there things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left that can still be rearranged. If we could just slow down enough to consider what's true and real, and always try to understand the way other people feel, and be less quick to anger and show appreciation more, and love the people in our lives like we've never loved before. If we treat each other with respect and more often wear a smile, remembering this special dash might only last a little while. So when your eulogy is being read with your life's actions to rehash, would you be proud of the things they say and how you spent your dash? Like I say, you probably have heard that one more than once over time. I hear it most often at funerals when folks are getting ready to get up and to speak and to give a eulogy. And it's a good poem, and it makes an important point. And I love this idea of the dash in between where the overwhelming majority of our life takes place in that one little place. Excuse me. But here's where the struggle is. As we look at that, there is implied in that there is a direction that we're going. There is a predefined movement from birth to death that we are moving, and that all that stuff that happens in between is really not nearly as important as those two things on the end. That we are always and constantly headed toward that second date. We do this in Christian thinking really well. For about the last 100 to 150 years or so, this has been a really important and really driving focus of the Christian life, which is that we've been talking a lot about in that time, making sure that we get into heaven. Now, you all have heard me say this before, and you'll hear me say this again, that getting into heaven is not the point of the Christian life. That is a side effect. That is something that happens when we do things right. This is, in fact, what Jesus is getting at when he is teaching and he is helping folks. It's most memorably in that time when he's talking to these two different groups of people. On the one hand, you've got these folks where he looks at them and they are kind of perturbed a little bit because it's like he's just told them that they are not getting into heaven. And he tells them, well, you didn't help me when I was in prison, when I was naked, when I needed food, when I was hurting, when I was suffering. All of these things, you didn't help me. And they say, well, Jesus, if you had told us that, we would have helped you. We never saw you like that. And remember his line is, when you did this for one of the least of these, you did this for me. And they're like, well, but that's not, if you just would have said those exact words, we would have done it. And Jesus said, I did. I told you these things. And here is proof of this. Look at this other group of people who were just as confused as the others because Jesus looks at them and says, you helped me when I was in prison and I was naked and I was sick and I needed clothes and I did all of this stuff. And they said, Jesus, when did we do that? He said, when you did this to one of the least of me, you did this for me. And they're like, oh, well, that was an option? They were really confused. Like, well, of course we were going to do that. We didn't know that was going to get us like a ticket into heaven or something. That was just what we were supposed to do. They understood the assignment. And they were good with that. Jesus is saying heaven will always be there. What concerns him is what are we doing now? And how do we, more importantly, how do we live now in such a way that we break out of this predefined movement from birth to death? How do we live now so that dash is really important? Question I like, how do we live now so that we don't live to death? Right? That's kind of what we're told we're supposed to do. We're supposed to live until we die. Well, there is more to it than that. And this is where we see Jacob come into this. And I love this story of Jacob because Jacob fits into this so really very well. And it was a long reading today, and that was intentionally a long reading because I wanted us to get his birth date and his death date. And for Jacob, that spans from chapter 25 to chapter 49. There's a lot of that, but that dash in between covers a lot of territory in the middle of that. And what makes Jacob so unique in this story is that from the beginning of his life, he was struggling against that predefined movement. He was struggling against this idea that I'm just going to live to death. He was trying to figure out something different. From the very beginning, Jacob kind of knows this to be true. Even before he is born, God tells his mother Rebekah and says, these two boys you're carrying, these twins, she didn't know she was having twins at that time. Imagine that surprise. And tells them they're going to do things differently. The younger one is going to be the master over the older one. And that is already going to upset a lot of things. So Jacob started life with this struggle. But Jacob doesn't start struggling at the beginning. It was a part of his life, but he first had to learn how things work. He started life living in that predefined movement of birth to death, of learning all of the rules. But the climax of Jacob's story comes when he really begins to let go of that movement. When he begins to say, I want off of this. I want to do something different. I am missing something. And so we come to Genesis 32. So we're a little ways into the story now. We come into this, and Jacob is there, and he has been struggling through it all. This is the climax of his story. Really comes in that famous story about him of when he is wrestling with God. And we know this is the climax of the story because this is when God changes his name from Jacob to Israel. We get this in chapter 32, verse 8. Then he, God, said to Jacob, your name won't be Jacob anymore, but Israel, because you struggled with God and with men and won. Now there's a lot of hand-wringing that goes on sometimes with this passage, because if we try to take this passage too literally, often when we take it at its most literal, it's taken literally, and then it's taken wildly out of context on top of that, so we're really confused, like Jacob is wrestling against God and he's going to beat God in a wrestling match. That's not something I expect out of Jacob. That's something I expect out of someone in Marceline, but not necessarily out of Jacob. Got one person to laugh at that one. Sorry, dear. We struggle with it. God, Jacob can beat God. No, Jacob isn't beating God. Jacob is struggling with a whole lot of things. And God is there with him so he can struggle against him, so he can figure it out. That's what Jacob is working on. And this is the moment when he begins to really figure it out. Jacob has learned through all the course of his life up to that point what the rules were, what the cultural expectations were, what role he was supposed to play, all of those norms of societies and cultural expectations that you grow up with, that we all grow up with, things that are as simple as how much do you tip at a restaurant, to what do you wear to a wedding, to what are the roles that men and women are supposed to take, to any number of things. We grow up and we have all of these often unstated, not written down rules that we all just naturally learn. That was where Jacob's problem was. Because we learn to follow all of those rules up until the point that we don't. And there was Jacob, and there was his struggle. Because those rules for him were breaking down. And we see this pretty consistently throughout his life, that multiple moments along the way we see where those rules break down. One of the first of them comes when he supposedly stole, quote unquote, or tricked Esau out of his birthright. This was something that was really fairly important. Now, it was kind of weird though in the setup, because remember, Esau is only about half a second older than Jacob is. Remember how the story goes as John read it, and he read through all of those names really well? If I had a gold star, John, you would get a gold star for today, because those were a lot of names in there. But Jacob is born literally holding on to Esau's ankle, right? Like half half a second different. But apparently that half a second is enough to give Esau some sort of magical authority as the firstborn, that he is now occupies this really special place. And you can even tell just by reading it, it's kind of uncomfortable, right? It seems a little odd, a little different, that somehow being born just that much early conveys on Esau all of this majesty. But when you take it in context of where they were, it actually was really important. Because it's one of those unspoken rules that guarantees when you're talking about big families, important families, wealthy families, families that have lots of stuff, like Isaac inherited from his father Abraham, as Abraham built that up, and then Isaac built it up some more, and then one of Isaac's sons was going to get this very large thing to manage, this large group of people, this very large family. To say that the firstborn was going to inherit was a way that guaranteed peaceful transitions, or mostly peaceful transitions. It was a way of keeping stability and leadership of this big, thriving, important organization. So this was a really big deal. It's why there's so much talk of the firstborn, because it means things are going to work better than if it was a free-for-all when the patriarch died. Which makes it all that more telling when Esau gives up that birthright for a bowl of soup. Literally a bowl of soup. Red lentil stew. Now, this is another place, if you read this passage really literally, you get folks that will start doing theological backflips to explain some sort of properties of the stew that he was eating, or maybe he was having some sort of health problems and that's just all that was left, or something. They will, like, if you get reading into things, they will go to great lengths to explain what was going on here. And you sit there and you read that and I go, I see none of this in Scripture anywhere. Because it's not. The important part of the story is that Esau was going to give up this big important thing for a bowl of soup. And that was it. Jacob is learning how to break all of the rules. Not necessarily because he wants to, but because he's learning that one of the other rules is that's just the way things work. So it's later on when we see him conspire with his mother to receive Isaac's blessing instead of his brother Esau. Isaac, who was at the end of his life at this point, was blind and so couldn't see which of his sons was up there. So Jacob and his mother Rebekah conspired to this thing so that they make a really tasty meal for Isaac, and then they literally cover Jacob in the hides of the animals that were slaughtered to make the food that they were going to feed to Isaac. And he receives Esau's blessing instead. Now you would think there's enough subterfuge there going on to survive anyone for a lifetime, but it's not, because we're not done yet. Because Jacob knows that Esau's going to be really mad at this, because Isaac looks at Esau when he comes up and says, I have no more blessings to give. I gave it to your brother. I can't give you one too. There's a whole side story sometime to talk about Isaac's role as a father that is really it's something. We'll come back to that at a later date. But Jacob runs after this because he knows how upset his brother is going to be. So he takes off, and as the story goes, if you read one of those Harlequin romance books that are down in the rummage sale, you know that this is where he meets a girl. Because that's what happens. He goes up, he meets a girl, and he decides he likes this girl, and he makes arrangements with her father to marry this girl. The wedding goes on, as the story goes, if you are familiar with this, that the next morning, after the wedding, Jacob wakes up and realizes that he married her sister. And then his new father-in-law Laban tricks him again to work even longer so that he can marry the one that he wanted to marry. And on top of all of this, and this leads to other crazy family dynamics later down the road, it's a mess at this point. But Jacob is learning things don't work the way that you were told. Because then one of the next stories we have is this trickery that goes on between Jacob and Laban, where ultimately leads to them nearly starting a war in between their family. And you can just feel, as you read the story, that Jacob is exhausted. He doesn't know what to do with this. That the way he was told the world worked is not the way that it works at all. And at the end of that part of the story, eventually Jacob and his father-in-law Laban, they arrange a ceasefire. They don't really ever reconcile. That family is broken. But they agree to stop with one another. Jacob is figuring some things out, though, at this point. He's figuring out he wants off. He wants off this crazy merry-go-round that he is on. Y'all ever ride a merry-go-round, one that probably looks a lot like the one that's over in Ripley Park? I'm not talking the nice, new plastic ones that look like they're probably hard to hurt yourself on. You can still do it, but they're nice, they're good, they look comfortable. I'm talking about the ones we all grew up on, that were metal with peeling paint. Doesn't matter if they were brand new, they still had peeling paint on there, that diamond-plated metal on the bottom of it. You get on there and you think, first couple of times around, this is great, this is fun. More kids get on, it's great. How many people can we pile on top of this thing, right? And then the big kids start spinning it, right? And you think it's good for about 30 seconds. And then you're like, I want off. I want off. And you can't get off. Because now the big kids are going to start spinning it faster and faster. And you're like, no, really, I want off. And you're trying to figure out, how do I get off of this merry-go-round? There was Jacob. He was searching for a way off. And this is where we find him wrestling with God. And that's where he finds his way out. Jacob is wrestling with God, not because he's going to try and beat God in a wrestling match, but because he's trying to figure out, how do I get out of this? Because remember, the thing that happens right before this verse picks up is that Jacob says to God, give me your blessing, saying, I want to align myself with you. I'm tired of the rest of this. This is where I want to be. This is where I need to be. This is where he has started to figure out that this is where he belongs, where it's going to be good, where he can find that dash and he can live that dash, not just in this predefined movement from life to death, but he can live in the middle of that there with God. That's what he's been looking for. And God says, you can have it. You can have it. And he said that's when he changes Jacob to Israel, saying, you are figuring this out. That there is more to life than all of the stuff you've gone through. I used to think, that we get to this part of the story, that Jacob was bribing Esau, he was weak, any number of different things. Because what happens before he wrestles God is that he starts sending all of his stuff to Esau. Like literally, like you get to that passage right before this, and it talks about like the day before, Jacob starts sending all of his possessions, all of his household goods, all of the flocks he has, all the animals he has, everything, sending it over to, and he'll say, his master Esau. And it's like, well, are you just bribing him so you can, because he sees Esau that's up there and he's got armed men with him. He's like, I'm not going to survive this battle if it comes to this. So it's like he's trying to bribe him, but I understand it differently now. Jacob wasn't bribing Esau. Jacob was saying, I'm tired. I'm tired of all of this stuff. And instead, he says, I'm going to align myself with God, and I'm going to be happy with wherever that is, and I'm going to do things, I'm going to put things back in the right order. And so he says, I know that Esau is the oldest. It isn't by much. It feels unfair, but I don't care. I'm going to put back with him all the things that were supposed to be his. That's why he refers to Esau as master. He's referring to Esau as head of the family, of having the position of the oldest child, once again saying, here are these things that should by right belong to you. I'm tired and I'm going to do things in a different way now. And that's when he begins to climb out of this deep hollowness that he'd been feeling. When he finally comes off of the merry-go-round and he says, I'm going to live as God has called me to live. What Jacob has discovered is what Father Richard Rohr calls second half living. I was first introduced to that concept. It wasn't new with Rohr, but it's one where I read it from him in his book, Falling Upwards, and he describes first half and second half living. The first half is the one where we build the containers that we live in, all the structures we follow, the rules we follow, the things that make us up, make us who we are. It is the place where we are at the center of that life, and we build everything around it so that it makes sense, so that we can live. We have to build that thing, so we have to have that. But when he says the second half living, tells us just how fragile that container is when we are at the center of our own lives. And that our goal is to get to the second half. The one where we realize that the container is fragile, that we are not at our best when we are at the center of our own lives, that we cannot live in that dash to the best of our abilities when that's where we stay. But he says where we find our fullness and our completeness is in the second half. when we align ourselves completely with God, we can handle all of the cracks in the container, the chips that come out of it, the ways that it begins to break and fall apart, and the times we have to go back and we have to rebuild it, but we can handle that, we can learn to live through that because we are with God in that second half. Over the next couple of weeks, that's what we are going to be exploring more of what that looks like. How do we jump off the merry-go-round? How do we let go? How do we come out of the hollowness? How do we find that dash in a way that is not just living from birth to death, but is living where we spend all of that time to begin with? In the process of that, we'll begin to learn that about ourselves. We'll begin to see that in others, and that is our hope and our goal, that we can see that in us, in others, and we can learn how to grow through it. For now, as we go from here, we remember what God did is he wants us to go and to find that place. He sent his son to come into a world to show us that better way. And so let us go and live that life to the best that we can, to see our lives as where we are and where we can be, and know that we have the potential to get there through all that Christ has done. Let us go and let us do this in his name. Amen.